Last Epoch endgame is suffering from issues that most likely will be fixed but are currently preventing me from enjoying the game, which is why I haven't made any guides or videos about it lately. Let me explain. Hey everyone, this is Thyworm and today let's talk about some of the issues in Last Epoch endgame that I currently see and why I think it is important. Enjoying Last Epoch content? Consider subscribing. So, what is the problem? Well, for me, the gameplay loop is currently the problem. In games, it is all about creating a gameplay loop that is fun and addictive. Essentially, you're constantly doing the same thing over and over again in any game. The job of the game dev is to make sure you don't notice this gameplay loop, or at least not the repetitive part. When looking at the current gameplay loop for Last Epoch, you're basically endlessly repeating the monolith of fate. Maybe you try a different build, maybe you empower the timelines, maybe you decide to not fight the bosses because you want to make it as far as possible and get as many echoes under your belt as you can, but in the end the gameplay loop is the same. Combine this with character progression by gaining levels and loot, and that is basically your standard action RPG hack and slash gameplay loop right there. It is important to state that there's nothing wrong with this. You could even argue that in life we're on a loop as well, and only significant life-changing events, which is why they call them life events, take you out of that loop. But all things considered, on a fundamental level, it is all rather repetitive. It doesn't make life pointless, it's just the way it is, and maybe to some extent necessary to make sense of it all. Imagine you would have new experiences in life every week. It would be exhausting after a while. Repetition isn't bad. You could even argue it's necessary to get a grasp on things. It does help if the activity, like your job, is fun though. When looking at the monolith, the gameplay loop is pretty obvious. There are some variations, some blessings, some bosses, but all in all it is the same thing. And I would argue that most of all, in order to enjoy the loop, you need one thing in particular, which is gear. You can get a build from anywhere, you can look up boss tactics, I suppose, but what is really required is gear, which makes sense because this is a loot-driven action RPG. The average person requires decent gear in order to complete the monolith, and specifically new players that don't have stashes full of stuff or extensive game knowledge will have to have decent gear to take on the monolith and basically start the gameplay loop. Once they are in the loop and they're having fun, they can play this game for hundreds of hours without any issues, and the people at 11th hour games can be considered successful. For me, however, and I think for many newer, inexperienced or casual players, this isn't happening right now. I am not getting into the gameplay loop. I am not immersing myself in the monolith. I am not getting sucked in by the endgame system. I still haven't even killed the level 100 monolith boss, even though it really would take me only an hour or two by now. I just can't be bothered at the moment. So why is that? Why did I go from playing this game pretty much non-stop to playing it around 50 hours per major patch and then back into waiting mode? It all has to do with gear. It all has to do with loot, and with the lack of a loot filter. Let me explain. In Last Epoch, there are basically two ways to get gear. You fight monsters and gear drops, or you gamble. Let's talk about dropping loot from monsters and chests. I have recently embarked on a small quest for science to actually look at all the gear that dropped for several days when playing the new patch. And what you will find is not really surprising, but loot in Last Epoch really sucks. Most of the gear that drops is complete garbage. It is absolutely useless. It is total crap. This is true in other games as well, by the way, but there you don't notice because of a loot filter. We're talking at least 95% of the loot here being total crap. Crafting materials excluded, of course, as they are always useful. The reason for this is that loot is completely RNG. The affix type, the affix tier and the base item determine the usefulness of gear, but because anything can roll on any base item pretty much, RNG reigns supreme. The vast majority of loot is really bad, and a lot of people are currently playing Last Epoch without even looking at loot anymore, specifically for this reason. On top of this, there's the crafting system, which adds more RNG into the mix by breaking items, and even if you find decent items that require crafting, it is still very much possible to completely render those items useless anyway after crafting because of a fracture. So what about the gambler? Well, the gambler is actually rather efficient for getting good gear. You have control over the base items that you get at the very least. You should gamble with a high level character so you have higher chance of rolling the best affixes. The gambler is by far the best way to gear any character, but it does have significant downsides as well. First of all, this timer after every gamble that takes a few seconds to roll the item is excruciatingly slow after gambling 100 items. I develop an instant dislike for the gambler every time I have to wait for this roll to complete. By now, I despise the gambler. It is so freaking tedious. Secondly, the costs. Unless you got a couple of million to spend on gearing characters, which you will need, by the way, you will run out of gold. Gambling is very expensive. So, how do you currently get gear in last Epoch patch 0.7.9? What it boils down to is this. You run a lot of monoliths or arenas without looking at any of the gear that drops because it's extremely time consuming and the loot is horrible anyway. So, you're running maps and you are farming gold. 2. You embark on a gambling session, hoping to get lucky, and this way you gamble your gear together so you can take on better and higher monolith levels. And that's it. That is how you get good gear. I find it very tedious. Any other way of getting gear takes you out of the game entirely. Hovering over each and every piece of loot? Please God no. Or enabling long loot names, but then you're still hovering over every piece of loot, but now with your eyeballs instead of your cursor, and on top of that you need to learn 100 affixes by heart? No thanks. The chest rewards at the end suffer from the same issue. I just want to get into the next monolith, but now I have to check all this loot? I'm just not doing it. But I don't like gambling either, because it is also extremely tedious, although it is much more efficient than just playing the game, which is a sad conclusion, but it is true. And the remedy to all of this is of course pretty simple, a loot filter. It will allow me to play the game as intended. It will allow me to run the monolith without the constant idea that I might be leaving valuable loot on the ground. It will allow me to only pick up valuable stuff without being continuously pulled out of the gameplay loop because I'm scanning loot. In short, it will make the game playable again for me. And this is why I am not really playing the game right now or am engaging with an otherwise probably good endgame system because I can't enjoy it. I have played too many other action RPGs by now that don't have this issue. It makes going back into endgame and last Epoch feels like an unenjoyable exercise regarding loot, which is one of the drivers to play the game in the first place. So I hope you guys get my point. It is the main reason I'm not making build guides or anything really. In order to create endgame content, I need to play endgame. And in order to come up with good builds, I need good gear. And right now, it's not possible to farm good gear in an enjoyable way. One of the main points of playing a loot-driven action RPG, getting loot, is simply not fun. For me, this is a massive problem. I am not sure how this is for others, but I am anxiously waiting for this loot filter to be implemented, because we really need it rather sooner than later, as most of the game revolves around endgame, which is good of course, as it increases the longevity of any action RPG. The issues with loot and progression become more and more apparent. They keep piling up, and a loot filter should have top priority over anything else basically. And that's it for now. I just wanted to make myself clear on this. I hope you enjoyed the video, ladies and gents. Thanks for watching and making it to the end. See you all soon. Bye bye.